So I'm just going to be like, sure. So I'm going to be the kind of ventriloquist presence. Yeah, to conclude this, also the presenter asked if in the discussion section of the panel, people can move in the front, because so that we can have more of a kind of communal discussion. So if you feel like it, move in the front. All right, so let me just introduce panel number 3 of the day, which is titled Invisible Extraction, Narratives, Imaginary, and Knowledge. It's a 2-people panel, so we have a little bit more of time for discussion. So without saying anything more, I will invite here Susanna to present her paper, which is titled Moose and Minerals, Narrative of an Extraction in the Yukon.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me well? Yes, okay. Yeah, so it's great to be here today. My name is Susanna. I'm from the Social and Cultural Anthropology department at the University of Vienna. I'm doing my PhD. My supervisors are Professor Peter Schweitzer and Dr. Gertrude Saxinger. Do I have to do something to start the screen sharing, or? Okay. Oh, slide 2. Here?
Right here.
Oh, or here, right?
Yeah, right.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so my PhD was part of the project LACE, Labor Mobility and Community Participation in the Extractive Industries, which ran from 2014 to 2019. And if you're interested in more of what we did, there's a link as well. I'm guessing that the presentations will be shared, or at least if you want to have it, you can email me. Yeah. So first of all, let me introduce you to the region where I worked. It's in the Yukon territory in Canada on Turtle Island or North America. The Yukon, as you can see here on this map, there's it's a part of the Tintina Gold Belt, as it is called, goes through the Yukon. It's a region of various mineral deposits, gold, zinc, lead, copper, for example. And my research was taking place around that, the right yellow dot where it says Dublin Gulch, so around that area. But at this point, I would like to remind everyone also that this is the homeland of not only indigenous peoples, but also of non-human ancestors and kin, or what indigenous societies understand as such. And keystone species such as moose, for example, or salmon, as well as medicinal plants, fungi, bacteria, and the whole community of life. If you're interested in having a look at this, I can really recommend this website. It's called nativeland.ca if you haven't seen it yet. I don't want to open it because I don't know what happens if I do. But it's a really, really nice project. And it's a sort of a mapping project of all the indigenous traditional territories across large parts of the world. And it really shows the richness and variety of indigenous societies also in North America and Turtle Island. So this is a map of the traditional territories of Yukon First Nations. I work primarily with the First Nation of Natchanayakdan, which is outlined with the sort of rose-colored, the rose color in the middle. Here's a map of Mayo, which is the main settlement. It's tiny. It's about 500 inhabitants, half of which are indigenous. Yeah, this is a map of the bit broader region. So if you see Elsa and Kino City, these are historic and contemporary mining sites where for over 100 years silver mining has occurred, and recently Canada's largest gold mine was developed as well. Canada's largest gold mine is called, it's operated by the company Victoria Gold. You can see a picture of the open pit mining operation here, and another map that shows a couple of other mining projects also in the Yukon. And on the right-hand bottom side, you can see an aerial view of Mayo, so you get an idea of the extent, and also in the back of the picture, actually, from the aerial view, you can see behind the river. It's a bit hard. I don't know if I can point around here. This is where the indigenous peoples settled in 1915 after mining came to the region, and it was decided that they should settle somewhere in the vicinity of Mayo. A couple of years later, in the 1950s, in 1958, people were relocated again to the eastern part of the town of Mayo. Our methodology was based on community-based participatory research, or inspired by it. Mostly, it was we talked extensively. We had a big focus on cooperating with media, the local indigenous organizations. We held public talks. We had a lot of outreach and science dissemination activities. We created a very nice booklet together with First Nation elders, where we had a book presentation and a signing ceremony as well. So over the course of those 5 years, we tried to interact as much as we could with various parts of Yukon society, I guess. So my central research question for my PhD is, what is Yukon First Nation indigenization in the context of extractivism? Here I should add that the research was guided by First Nation research needs. So the questions I developed mostly in collaboration with the Natchanakdan First Nation. The first one that I already mentioned is, how do First Nation of Natchanakdan elders perceive the changes that were brought by mining colonialism and extractivism to their First Nation and the Mayo region? And this resulted in the booklet that I mentioned. You can download it online. There's a link here also. And a picture of the cover on the right upper side. Then the second part is, which resulted in a book chapter, is a co-authored book chapter, is how do Yukon First Nation youth perceive the influences of mining and extractivism on their lives and communities. Again, it's also open access, and you can have a look at it if you're interested. And then thirdly, also a book chapter that will come out soon is on the question of which role does the built environment, and especially cultural centers, play for the revitalization of Yukon Indigenous societies. And finally, and this is what I'm focusing on today, is how is the Yukon narratively reconfigured as Indigenous homeland after decades of being understood as a mineral treasure box, ready to be exploited for financial gain. So just two quick things about extractivism, and a note on what I call prerequisites of extraction. So we've heard about, and I don't need to tell you what extractivism is, but importantly for this talk, it's a defining characteristic of the Canadian settler state. Further, I argue that there are several prerequisites of extraction. I follow Dietz and Engel's approach in that, and they're basically saying that there's states and actors and variety of prerequisites for extraction that exist, but there's also narrative and imaginary, which is important in this regard. So land must be narrated and imagined as extractable, meaning that the public and popular imaginary is already there or being created. So this is what I'm focusing on in my article. So imaginaries and sovereignty, a little bit more on that. Or actually the Yukon history of colonization. It started from the fur traders in the late 19th century, went quickly to mineral discoveries at the turning of the 19th and 20th century. which is when sort of a heavy process of heavy colonization started in the Yukon. It was actually not as heavy until about the mid-20th century, when things became really industrialized, heavily industrialized, roads were being built and so on. In the beginning of the 20th century, as I've mentioned before already, is that the First Nation of Na-Chu-Nyak-Dan, or Dan people, as they were calling themselves then, were seen as an impediment to mining. And from archival research and records, one can see that they were seen as an obstacle, and there was of course a very patriarchal and racist relationship between the newcomers, the miners, and the First Nation, and they were sort of put on a reserve. Which was the old village, which I showed you before on the picture. Later in the 1970s, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry, which some of you might have heard about, led by Justice Berger, led to a gradual narrative turn from frontier to homeland. But in any case, the extractive industry plays a crucial role in the colonial transformation of the Yukon, and especially so in the Mayo region and the traditional territory of the First Nation of Na-Chu-Nyak-Dan. However, and that was something that was surprising me, in anthropological inquiry, mining and extractivism only plays a marginal role so far. So that's why I thought I should focus on that for my last article. Today, Yukon First Nations are actively involved in reshaping the dominant resource imaginary by changing mining legislation, and they cooperate with a broad range of actors on these issues. And the reason why, or one of the reasons why, is also because royalty rates are shockingly low, and actually only 0.03% of mineral production value was collected by the territorial government on behalf of Yukon society, and that was in 2020. So that obviously corresponds to the definition of extractivism as a form of imperialism that leaves very few of the value created by resource extraction in the areas where the resource is actually located. So I argued that the Yukon is understood primarily in relation to the extraction of its natural resources as part of an imperial, colonial, and assimilationist capitalo-extractivist mindset. And that mining narratives are part of apparatuses produced by promoters of extraction to render extraction possible and legitimate. I use place and road names, as examples of how the land is imagined in relation to its mineral resources and their extraction. And you can see in this picture a couple of examples. So, for example, to reach Mayo from downtown Whitehorse, which is the region's capital and regional hub, you have to drive up Quartz Road and then Copper Road, and then you get on the Klondike Highway, which is named after the famous Klondike Gold Rush. And then at some point you need to turn right and go down the Silver Trail to arrive at the community of Mayo, which was named after an Italian prospector. And when you go there, you drive past Ethel Lake, and Ethel Lake is an important traditional fishing ground for the First Nation of Na-Chu-Nyak-Dan, and is actually called Kwanteyman, which means fire lake. Ethel was most probably the wife of a prospector. So these place and road names are just one example of how the land is narrated in terms of mineral extraction and discovery. Imaginaries, I use this notion, it's a central notion of my article and my argument, and they have a concrete location in material objects, institutions, and practices, and they're also carried in images, stories, and legends. So I argue that there are two key Yukon imaginaries. One is the resource imaginary, and this is exemplified by these images or murals that you can find on houses in Whitehorse in the Yukon. So you can see the central role of transportation infrastructure, for example, with the railway construction and the stern wheelers that were shipping down the ore from Mayo to Whitehorse until the road was built, or also this trope of the hardy lone white male miner who is going through hardships, like sitting alone in his cave, or going up this very steep slope of the White Pass during the time of the gold rush, the Klondike gold rush. And this is sort of juxtaposed with the second key, or with another key Yukon imaginary, which is the indigenous imaginaries. I should say imaginaries, of course, because there's a variety of different First Nations, including Inuit communities in the Yukon. And here you can see tropes of connection to land, connection to non-human kin and ancestors or animals, and also a complication of this simplified mining narratives with the picture on the bottom right, which I interpret as a critique of the influence of colonial extractivism, and especially on indigenous women and girls. I also focus on narrative or use narrative theory. So imaginary storytelling, narratives and human world making are closely related according to narrative theory. Struggles over truth and knowledge take place through narration and storytelling, thus complicating, sometimes appropriating or delegitimizing mining narratives. According to narrative theory, every form of narrative originates in storytelling. And Julie Cruikshank, a famous Yukon anthropologist, says that human rationality is tied directly to narrative structure and unity. Niles goes as far as calling our species Homo narrans, so the storytelling species, who has the ability to create the past, the present, as well as new futures and the values it will uphold by means of storytelling. And indigenous writer and storyteller Thomas King sums it up by saying the truth about stories is that that's all we are. There's, by the way, also a famous Portuguese poet named Fernando Pessoa, who has written a very beautiful poem, and at the end of it, he also says, we are stories that tell stories, and that's it. So I thought that was quite beautiful as well. Stories and imaginaries. Stories form part of the imaginaries, as I explained, and I want to, and imaginaries at the same time need to be differentiated into broader societal imaginaries that are shared by larger groups of people, and then individual imaginaries, so the ways individuals imagine their relationship to land, for example. For the broader societal imaginary, I'm focusing on the example of the Storytime space and the Peel Watershed tent that was in 2016 in downtown Mayo. And there, people, the idea was that it was a heritage initiative from the First Nation government, initiated by the First Nation government. And the idea was to reclaim narrative authority. So the idea was that then heritage manager was telling me that, that then heritage manager was telling me that they want to tell their own stories and decide which ones they're going to tell, when and where. And she also emphasized that stories make connections both within, so they create a space where people come together and enjoy each other's company, but also to outsiders who come and ask questions about life in the North. And she also emphasized that it is then and there where decisions are being made about which stories are being told and which narratives are getting out into the world as well. These stories include not only origin stories, for example, but also the struggle for land and the fight for protection of land and water, exemplified by the Peel watershed. Peel watershed is a region that was supposed to be opened for extraction. There was a fight which went to the Canadian high courts. In the end, the First Nations who teamed up for this court case won. So large parts of the Peel watershed, this pristine and culturally really significant area, which is also within the traditional territory of the First Nation of Natchenak-Dan, are now protected. The second part is the, as I promised, are the person-centered imaginaries. Here I bring a couple of ethnographic examples. So the idea is to gain a deeper understanding of how extractivism and mining, in this case, shapes people's understanding of themselves as well, and and leads to what kind of subject formation. So we have a found a broad range from full incorporation, such as it's in my blood, I'm a natural born operator, I'm a miner in the third generation, to pragmatic defeatism or fatalism, saying things like, well, it's the only thing we have, so we got to live with it. There's nothing else. Some also like full resistance, like, yeah, mining is something we don't want. The appreciation of good wages, social, relational, and spiritual opposition in the sense of we're tearing out the veins of Mother Earth, for example, or reproach about lacking economic options, dire realities of camp life, or the fact that mining led to heavy assimilation. Many cautionary tales are told with respect to the environment, saying that we are allowing mining to happen, but we want it to happen with the utmost respect for nature and animals and the least damage possible. There's also processes of normalization that are being set in motion, exemplified in quotes such as our connection to mining goes way back in time, or we have always had mining, which is interesting if you think that mining has actually only been there for a little bit more than 100 years, or it's in my blood, for example. Then also interesting, there's more of the long-term thinking. So resources are seen as currently not necessarily extractable. Instead, they can in later time be extracted for the benefit of others or future generations. As in we can mine in 100 years from now. And finally, main takeaways are that there's no dualistic opposition between the resource imaginary and First Nation imaginaries. A lot of time, oppositional views can be held within one and the same person. And the reason why I'm showing this flag is also because the First Nation revitalization and First Nation imaginaries are not really seen as in opposition to extractivism or capitalism or so on, but more as a matter of the heart and the identity and so on. And I think this beautiful beadwork that was a collaborative project by expert beaders in Mayo really nicely exemplifies this. So thank you very much. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next and last presenter for the day is Federico Giovannini from the University of Bologna. Do you want to come up? Let me get out of this.
I sent it. Where is it?
Okay. Oh, you sent it before. Okay. Presentation.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to present this research of mine. My name is Federico Giovannini, and I'm studying global cultures at the University of Bologna. And today I'm presenting my research on the notion of moral extractivism, taking the case of the war in Ukraine. And particularly, I'm going to explore how digital humanitarianism in the West, how it used war morals as a new frontier. It gave It turned war morals as a new frontier for capital extraction. And yeah.
Sorry.
No worries.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, so let's begin. When the war broke out, obviously everyone was deeply struck by it, and particularly in the West, there were huge moral, emotional reactions. So when the war began, at first there was a slight prospect of political mobilization. We saw, for instance, in Berlin, in Rome, people going to the square and protesting in the streets against the war. But after 1 week, mostly the moral outrage was expressed within social media, and it didn't go much beyond that. I was personally very struck by it, and this is how my research began, actually, because I started to ask myself, why is it that despite the massive wave of moral reaction to the war in Ukraine, most of Western citizens did not politically mobilize to stop it? So we're going to understand this by first contextualizing this lack of politicization by looking at the post-political condition in the West. Then I will present Google, Amazon, Meta, and Apple's digital humanitarianism for Ukraine. And I'm going to acknowledge the moral reality of the war, because the point is that it's a social fact that everyone experienced it morally somehow. And then I will present the notion of moral extraction, and I will connect it to the post-political condition in the West through the notion of moral waste. So first part, the post-political, debate on depoliticization, the political, and the post-political. The debate on depoliticization has been going on for over 20 years. It began in the 90s, and different labels have been employed to understand depoliticization in the West, like post-democracy, post-politics, post-political, and in general, what is common to all of the theories and labels employed is that depoliticization is an absence, a disarticulation or mystification of social antagonism within society. And many theories of depoliticization employed the notion of the political in order to critically assess this condition. The main ones are Rancière, Zizek, and Mouffe. I'm going to take in particular Mouffe's theory of the political for our analysis, because it's the one that takes the ethics as central to the notion of the political. And in this research, it's particularly important the role of the ethics and emotions and passions. So let's see what Mouffe theory is about. She puts together different authors in order to develop her idea of the political. So the political emerges when there is a construction of a we antagonizing a they. So it's always collective and relational. And this we is hierarchically related to the they. So the we is above the they. And obviously, any we, in order to exist, always needs a constitutive outside. So there can't be a we without a they. And most importantly, the central aspect of this theory for what we're concerned with is that there is always an identification process in the construction of this antagonism. So the political always is embedded in an effective investment of the instincts for love and death. So when we create a we channel our instinct for love in the we, so that the we is glued together, and we discharge our aggressivity towards the they. So what is the post-political condition? Basically, if we take politics as the set of practices and institutions that establish order in society, the post-political condition is one in which politics is freed from the political. So order in society is reproduced without social antagonisms taking part of it and emerging. And right now, we live in a post-political condition where there's a lack of counter-hegemonic struggle against the neoliberal discourse. So now that we contextualize it a bit with the post-political condition, I can explain why and how Gamma's digital humanitarian intervention is a form of moral extraction. So I don't know if any of you has Apple devices, but after the war broke out, there were lots of banners like this one to ask to donate for families affected by the crisis in Ukraine. Also, Amazon, for instance, had this permanent banner asking for a contribution right away as you open the homepage. What they did, Google, Amazon, Meta, and Apple, amongst many other companies that had ad hoc policies for charity, is that they give lots of advertising credits. Google has given $5 million credits to humanitarian and intergovernmental organizations. Amazon inserted this permanent banner, which you saw. Meta made fundraising much easier, both on Instagram and Facebook. You could see in lots of stories or Instagram biographies that you could easily, like start a fundraising or, for instance, share one so that it would be easier to donate. Plus, they donated also 10 million worth of ad credits. And Apple basically put donation banners in almost all of their apps, as you can see. The donations were pretty successful. In Amazon, for instance, by April 22, we had over $5 million in donations, and on Facebook, basically almost 10 millions by mid-May, and etc. So, what is this notion of moral extraction? I will explain by starting from the outside, which is the war morals that are extracted. How I will explain how this moral outside is reproduced by Gamma, and how the extraction takes place. At the end, I will connect it to the post-political condition through the notion of moral waste. So, war morals, I take it as a social fact that they exist following Michael Walzer, that basically explains that in times of war, human agents do not merely talk morality, but they also experience the world morally. And we saw this everywhere from traditional to social media, Biden expressing outrage, and ordinary citizens. I think this was very common for everyone who was also on social media in general. Many moral commentaries and reactions. And war morals, I take them to be constituted by the ethics that we have. So, for instance, outrage, compassion, and all the kind of moral ethics that we have when the war is presented to us through the news, through images and social media, and the moral vocabulary. So, for instance, the expression like unjust invasion, innocent victims, etc. Obviously, the cultivation of war morals is a form of social cooperation that is not directly organized by Gamma. So, war moral emotions, like in general moral emotions, they can be the fuel for political mobilization. In most theory, as we saw, the affects are central to mobilize politically. She refers to the affects as the capacity of a body to be affected or to affect. And obviously, this affective capacity is what makes human beings act. We need to have a sort of energy in order to do something in general, to act. So moral emotions, which are individual and non-political, can be channeled in a collective and political discourse that mobilizes the collectivity. Taking this as a starting point, how were these moral war morals reproduced? Well, Gamma, as you all know, boycotted Russia in different ways by suspending operations like Google Pay and Amazon did, or Apple suspending all sale, and Meta suspended Russian advertising. Plus, they eased their policy on violent speech, allowing statements such as "death to Russian invaders." Obviously, the boycotting is a form of moral condemnation, which then feeds with the general cultivation of war morals. And the ads themselves, they remind users of the war in moral terms, because I mean, an act of charity is always implicitly a moral act. And obviously also the infrastructural platforms themselves, they are a crucial space for the circulation of news, images, and comments that nourish moral, emotional reaction to the war. So when Gamma's pages and apps began to display the permanent banners, the fundraisings, and the ads for charity donations, users, just hit by their moral reactions and emotions, they found immediately an opportunity to discharge their emotions into an act of charity. In this sense, obviously, this brought them to stay more on the websites. So with more clicks, there were more data to be accumulated and collected by Gamma. And plus, Gamma's brand got associated with a just and moral act by the users. So this unconsciously brought people to see Gamma in a better light. And this obviously valorized the brand of Gamma. So this is from the point of view of the economic extraction. But what I'm more interested in is the political aspect of extraction. Gamma, by displaying this ads and banners and fundraisings, increased their reputational value. In the public sphere, they're not usually associated with democratic tendencies, but in a moment where people are heavily morally involved with the debate for the war in Ukraine, obviously this puts Gamma under a good light, being associated with the good side. And above all, the moral emotions that people had in that moment were basically neutralized and sterilized because they were prevented from being channeled into political mobilization. Because instead of saying, okay, I've got this huge anger within myself, what do I do with it? If you see the banner, you click and you feel at least that you discharge part of it. And so this prevents these war moral reactions to be the fuel for political mobilization. So in this sense, the political acquiescence of Western citizens was somehow reproduced by these policies. And as we know, capital operations, in order to keep up with the cycle of accumulation of capital, they need a certain political environment that is not that does not hindrance their work. And so yeah, you see the contrast between simply channeling your emotions into a click, or taking the street in order to do that. And yeah, so how does the moral waste come into play? From the perspective of the political, as we saw before, individual emotions can turn into collective passions. In this sense, these policies, they turned the war morals that were being cultivated into a moral waste. So basically, these policies neutralized the potential antagonism that could emerge from the Western citizens' effective response to the war. In this sense, the post-political condition was reinforced and consolidated. Indeed, we didn't see any mass political mobilization to stop the war just after a few weeks that the war broke out. Yeah, so as I saw, in this sense, the post-political condition is reproduced, and it leaves the current neoliberal hegemony untouched. However, war morals, they're a side of extraction, but also potential side of resistance as such. Indeed, a new counter-hegemonic discourse can always re-articulate the war morals that are now being neutralized. So turning them from being moral waste to actual fuel for political mobilization. Because the political always needs effective investments, like moral ethics could be, and floating elements to hegemonize, like the moral vocabulary that is extensively being employed. The frontiers of capital, like war morals, are the potential site for the return of the political. So to conclude, moral extractivism is a way of connecting extractivism with the post-political condition. Moral waste can be reversed. So war morals, as we just said, they are a potential side to resist the very capital that invests in their reproduction. Indeed, Gamma is working on reproducing it, reproducing the condition that allow for war morals to emerge. But this, can be turned upside down. They could be working for the exact opposite reason, right? I mean, they're creating a space for others to resist their activity. Moral extractivism, above all, allows different possibilities for future research on depolitization and contemporary operations of capital, because it expands our analytical lenses to include both the effective dimension and also the moral one. So I really think it's important to start to, in our research on the operations of capital and depolitization, also at the moral philosophy and effective ground. I think it could be really much more useful. And yeah, some of the bibliography I mentioned, and thank you.
All right. So as I was saying, I'm just gonna read out Alex's comment. We'll have like some moment of weird extraneation feeling, but that's fine. All right. So thank you, Susanna and Federico, for these very interesting papers, and thank you to the CEU organizer for this wonderful program. I'm sorry for not being with you in person today. That's the extraneation bit. The papers are quite different in both subject and academic style, so it's a bit of a challenge to address them both in a breath, but I'll try. Taking cues from our organizer, they call the panel Invisible Extraction, Narrative, Imagination, and Knowledge. I understand that the two papers in some way address the relationship between capitalist extractivism on one end and the symbolic processes that enable it or opposes the process that make it manifest or invisible in the other. In these comments, I will thus center and problematize symbolic production and its place in the extractivist capitalist system. In the end, I believe this might be a fruitful angle for this paper and the conference, not just because it is thematically adequate, but because an explicit focus on the symbolic practices as such problematize conventional concept of capitalism and domination, as well as its structure. So a word about each of the paper first. So she starts from Susanna. Susanna paper is a paper over the long haul, probably toward the PhD thesis, question mark. Mooses and minerals seek to capture Native American place in Yukon's mining industry throughout the history of colonization in North America / Canada. And conversely, the place of industrial extractivism in their life, their practices, their story and histories, and their cosmologies, Susanna is especially focused on symbolic production, in fact, since the driving concept in the paper is that of the narrative, and she draws on recurrent classical concept, enriched with more post-structuralist social theory. Susanna's work gives an intriguing glimpse into the complexity of Canadian Indian positionality in Yukon as an ethnic minority, once subjugated, colonized, and segregated, but also a minority that is now organized through autonomous state body and self-administered as a First Nation. A minority that has also partly adapted to the industry and that today seems to take for granted that a degree of prosperity has come to them through mining, at least to some people in the community that is represented here in some ways. So she has a few specific questions and remarks for Susanna first, and then she will do the same for Federico. First is, you talk of narrative, but not so much of power relation and hierarchies, especially within the Native community. What are the groups, the layers, the tension, and how are they reflected in discourse and topics? For example, I was wondering if the title Moose and Minerals express a tension between primordialist radical oppositional politics on one end and a more assimilationist or more official politics, where the latter by becoming from a better off elite of native policymaker and the former from perhaps educated group with cultural capital, but less grounded in local politics. This depiction might be off, she says, but the question about this tension between power relation actually remains. Relatedly, it is unclear to me to which extent natives are absorbed in the mining workforce and or came to secrete a power elite since autonomy was obtained. So does the story of Yukon narrative differ, for example, from that of Navajo Nation confined to a sterile part of the Arizona desert? It seems it does, she says, and it would be interesting to compare and contrast national and local history of colonization and their outcome in different contexts. It is unclear to me, to her, after reading your paper, to what extent the extractivist narratives has penetrated and colonized the narrative of natives themselves. Can you clarify this? When and how does it show? And to what extent does the non-human nature equate a resource in First Nation discourse? And where and does this kind of relationship show? Then she says, you are careful to distinguish between narrative and culture as concepts. And to explain your choice of the first as a distinct from a cultural anthropologist kind of understanding of culture. She said, this is understood. De facto is that culture is an unique concept. The heritage is part of another industry, the cultural industry. That your respondents, as a result, are specialists in invented tradition and in reification. I believe you should make culture front and center for this reason and explain, not necessarily in this paper or chapter, but in a chapter of your thesis, how your subject make culture, with what conceptual tools and which ethnographic resources and sources they use. This should also lead to a reflection on the hybrid narrative that they produce, or alternatively, the labor of purification with which they are compelled to produce in order to control the spillover and pollution that mining and Western culture has inevitably generated over time. What do you think about this suggestion? So I'm just going to read through the questions and then we'll discuss after. And finally, also for Susanna, a methodological question. How do you feel being a non-native and a European doing fieldwork in a place where First Nations have successfully reclaimed the right to produce knowledge about themselves? How do you reconcile your own position as an anthropologist with the ethics of not speaking in someone's name and or the ethics of co-production of knowledge? Has it been difficult for you? Now to Federico paper. This is a much shorter paper that reads more as a thoughtful reaction to both the event of the Ukraine war and to Sandro Mezzadar's work. It's more theoretically driven than Susanna's. Federico looks at the way in which the main internet-based corporation, Gammon, so Duo, Amazon, Meta, Apple, and Microsoft, which appear and disappear, have used and occupied the Ukrainian war in order to build up their brand and accumulate data. Through ads calling for aid donation in particular, they have acted as vehicle of Western ideology, cast themselves as virtuous actor, and boosted data-generated traffic on the website and social network. Federico uses Mezzadar's concept of the frontier of capitalism to build up a concept of moral extraction, through which he captured the activity of the Gammon. The Gammon work at the frontier of capitalism because they harvest data point by relying on non-productive, non-capitalist activity, which is essentially of an emotional nature or affective nature, as you call it. Emotion turn into resources, which turn into profit. So by relying on move definition of the political as the discourse of the we, emotionally opposed to a generalized opponent, they, Federico goes on to argue that moral extraction equates depoliticization. I presume capturing the people moral labor and putting it in the service of state of capital-driven hegemonic struggle. So question for you. First, your essay for her is a bit inconclusive. Since you say that emotional extraction means depoliticization, but also signifies the existence of an emotional capital that you suggest might be reinvested at some point into politics. We're missing a practical or institutional link that would permit us to do the conversion of emotional activity back into politics. So what are the conditions, both historical and institutional, for which hypothetical conversion back into politics could happen? And here Sandra Mezza's work might give us some direction to talk with. Then the second question is, isn't the Ukraine case or the Ukraine war a bad case through which to discuss depoliticization, which it resuscitated the old enmity between Russia and the West in some form? So more generally, by calling the gammon-bred discourse depoliticized, don't you force your own normative concept of what should count as the political? Do you operate specifically as a class-based concept of the political? If not, what assemblies or collective then count as political? This might be also a question about move concept of the political at large. We rest on the concept of hegemony that is either underspecified, any movement is political, or overspecified. Only anti-capitalist movements are political. Your essay, finally, is rich theoretically and the thinking astute. I'm not sure I understand, however, the theoretical purchase of moral extraction over existing notion, in particular the classical notion of commodification. Isn't moral structure a case of the commodification of everything which capitalism combined with digital technology is affecting so dramatically? Finally, a question to both of you. Sorry, I'm just reading questions after that. What is invisible in both papers is not extraction, which is in some ways by design all too visible. I think she's building on the title of invisibility, but the infrastructure of cultural and symbolic production that mediate actually extraction and permits and allows these oppositional movements. In other form, none of you really problematize the material infrastructure that enables or shut down oppositional politics. In Susanna's paper, the spokesperson, whether the politician, the activist, the cultural worker, their origin, trainings, and so on, is not discussed. In Federico's paper, perhaps more conspicuously, the word algorithm, which appeared once, I think, is the only direct reference to the technological specificity of the gammon. They're part of the capitalist system, but the mode of production they reflect is neither industrial nor financial capitalism. It is not either as new as the Ukraine war. So it seems to me that there's a mode of production in which symbolic production plays a significant role, and the particularity of which needs to be taken into account in both papers. Thank you. So I would suggest maybe two of you come up, and if you want to engage with any of these questions first, and then maybe we open a question from the audience.
Do you mind sitting closer to us, or would you like to? Yeah, please.
Just for the last hour or half Thank you. I'm not sure I remember all of the questions. It would have been good to have them in a written form, but I'm sure we'll get them later. I wrote down two that I would like to respond to. One of them was the comment on the methodology and my positionality and how I reconcile being a white European researcher and anthropologist working with Yukon First Nations. So that one is kind of easy to answer because basically I came to the Yukon together with my supervisor who had a project proposal that we took to several First Nation governments, and it was actually about mine workers and how they deal with shift work in mines and being away from home for 2 weeks, or whatever the shift roster time is. So we proposed to work with mine workers primarily, and the National First Nation accepted the project, and they asked specifically to include in this research the First Nation elders, and to ask this question of how they perceive the influence of the mining industry in their lives and their community. So I jumped to that opportunity, and I took that as my starting point in this research. And from there, gradually, I developed a relationship, or we developed a relationship, and deeper relationship with the First Nation National Heritage Department. And from there, the other research needs came out, and that was what I was guided by and what my research was guided by. So I felt sort of comfortable by not bringing in my own agenda, but really letting myself be guided by the local needs, and also engage in mutual capacity building, seeing myself as somebody who's there primarily to learn, and also to give back to the community as far as I can. I also, like I mentioned, we really did a lot of community outreach and really tried to produce some outcomes that could be seen as useful to the community. For example, the booklet that we created, that I was mostly in charge of, is now has been sold quite a number of times, and the revenues are going to the daycare. So there's some like actual material benefits that are going to the community from that. And yeah, in terms of co-design and like co-authorship, I mentioned two. One of the book chapters I wrote, I co-authored with two young Indigenous women who are from the community. So yeah, I think we were doing as much as we could or thought was best. And the second question I wanted to answer was her question about antagonisms and hierarchies and so on, which I found is very interesting, but it's also a bit difficult in the sense that in the Yukon there's a strong sense of collaboration, and there's a saying, you don't burn bridges in the Yukon, which is I think mainly due to the fact that it can get quite cold. It's quite not a very populated area. You might be dependent. If you get into a fight with somebody, they might be the person that you need the next day because your car broke down or whatever. So there's generally a sense of downplaying conflicts. So I didn't encounter much open opposition to mining or extractivism in that sense. However, I did, in the instances where I did encounter it, it was generally, you could say it was voiced by people who were definitely not profiting from mining as much as others. For example, a young person who would say, I love this place, I would like to live here, but the only jobs that exist are in the mining industry. Whereas his friend who had already worked in a mine was like, yeah, that's true, but you really make good money. So he hadn't worked in the mining yet. She did, so that became very clear that she had more of a positive outlook on mining. Or another person that actually was a hitchhiker that I took along one time, who was, I started to talk about history and mining with him, and he became really upset when I mentioned the topic of mining, and it became very clear that throughout his family history, for example, too, a lot of things have happened to him personally and to his family and to his community that are directly related to mining, that are very difficult to discuss, and caused much pain. And the same goes for First Nation elders, for example, in the town, which those are things that that are also in the booklet that we produced. Stories of femicide, of attempted or actual abuse. So that there's many gruesome stories out there, actually. But they're also difficult to voice, and that's also the question of what is my role. And it was not the focus of my research. And for me, it's also a question of being respectful and respecting the boundaries that I'm being given. And because the focus is very much on speaking truth, reconciling, and moving forward. It's you hear this a lot in the Yukon. It's the idea is to move forward, to take history and make the best out of it and move forward. So and these are all the reasons why I think I'm not stressing these difficult aspects so much in relation to mining, although I do mention them in part in the article, actually. yeah, I think there were a lot of other questions, but I'll pass the torch on to you.
Thank you. So I'll start from the last question. So if I understood correctly, because it was a pretty dense commentary. So the question is if moral extractivism and moral extraction is can be seen as a part of the larger process of commodification of life in general, I guess.
I think she's asking the moral. I think she's asking what is the basically what do you gain theoretically by talking about moral extraction rather than just the process of commodification.
Okay, I get it. Yeah, okay. What you gain is that you acknowledge the centrality. So if we are studying the operations of capital in order to understand how capital hegemonizes society and how you can resist it. So if this is your goal, then you need to acknowledge a fundamental aspect of human existence, which is the affective aspect. And so what you gain in it is that you can more easily connect this topic to psychology and to political mobilization in a wider sense. So I think it gives more opportunity to connect more disciplines in understanding the operations of capital. This is what I try to do, basically. I try to connect more vocabularies and more perspectives, because I think if one starts from the idea that human beings act because they have a certain affective state, because they have certain desires, they have some certain also internal condition which is socially constructed, then you have a new world that is introduced to the research in extractivism. Yeah. So yeah, and then the other questions were so if basically about the limits of the notion of the political of Chantal Mouffe. So she wonders when is exactly something political or not. The point is that it has to be. I couldn't explain it in the presentation, but it's in the paper. It has to be collective, but it also needs to, the discourse you create needs to be a discourse of collectivity, of antagonism, but it also needs to be a discourse that takes the elements present in the neoliberal discourse in general and tries to rearticulate more than one element. Then you have hegemonic struggle. So for instance, if you have the no-vax against the pro-vax discourse, there you have just few elements which are common that are contended by the two discourses. The one of the vaccine, but for the rest, they're really two worlds apart. They're really two communities apart that use other elements in their discourse. In that case, it's not really an hegemonic struggle unless, compared, for instance, to what could be the struggle between a fascist and a communist discourse that try to really contend much more elements within their discourses that are along the frontier of both of them. I hope this was not too technical as an answer. And then how does the political return? I think that was the first. It's not up to me to give the solution, but at least we can. What the point of my paper was to give a specific focus on where to look when one is trying to assess if the direction that a certain group or collectivity is taken in society in creating a project of resistance, basically. Yeah. And concerning the materiality, did you want to? Oh, okay. And concerning the materiality, I think she's right. The paper was short, and I will expand on it, hopefully in the future. So yeah, I take it as a useful comment.
Thanks. Question. We'll start. We'll progress geographically.
Hi, thank you for that discussion. Susanna, I have a question for you actually. And I just actually wanted to know about your ethnography. And I was wondering, how exactly this resource imaginary was playing out how exactly was this resource imaginary playing out materially in your field site, I want to know. And in the process, if you could explain why you decided to, why it was so important to use the tool of imaginary to like conceptualize your research. And because I was also thinking about what Giza Vescalnis defines as anticipatory economy and a sort of futuristic claim over resources which may not have been tapped yet. And I was wondering if you're on to something similar to what she refers to as, a very strategic, slow process of gaining access to something which is mostly phantom and probably does not exist at all. So if you could just shed some light on your ethnography, maybe. And Federico, I have like one very like small question, which is that I really found it very thought provoking, where you're trying to build on these emotive sensibilities, and especially engaging in bringing in this whole technosphere in conversation. And I was wondering why would you define these spaces as devoid of emotive sensibilities and depoliticized? And I was wondering if perhaps they are also politically generative in a way, and in the sense that just like probably you could explain a little about what kind of emotive sensibilities are you really focusing on, because when it comes to war there's outrage, anger, grief, and all of those. And I was wondering if there's something that you were trying to look at, and if you'd like to explain that.
Yes, thank you very much. A comment on Federico's paper. In a way, I was familiar with the argument. I find your paper really original and thought-provoking. I am afraid I will kind of reframe two of the questions asked by Alexandra in her comment. The first one has to do with the notion of depoliticization. I've always been kind of worried of this notion. And why? Because I think that the problem can be in the lens through which we look at politics. And maybe there are some lenses that do not allow us to see processes of politicization that take forms that are different than the traditional ones. So the notion of depoliticization is definitely powerful, but it can be misleading and, in a way, obscuring. From this point of view, my modest opinion is that Chantal Mouffe doesn't help us with her, grand theory of the political built upon Carl Schmitt, the enemy, the friend, and so on. Maybe we need more flexible conceptual tools and lenses, particularly in such a moment of transition uncertainty as the one we're currently living through. Then, listening to you, I have the impression that there is a link between the way in which you understand the depoliticization and the description of moral extractivism, meaning that one has the impression that moral extractivism is really very, very powerful. It can neutralize every kind of affect raised by the war, So sometimes while I was listening to you, I was thinking of the notion of cultural industry as it was originally developed by Adorno and Durkheim. Last question. Why extraction? Alexandra asked a similar question, but what is specific in the notion of extraction that helps you understand the operations that you critically describe? I would like you to be a bit more, let's say, technical in talking about extraction in moral extractivism, because we can talk about capture of affects, for instance. So, what is the difference between capture and extraction?
It's also for you, Federico. Thank you both for really interesting presentations. It's also kind of thoughts, but maybe they'll converge into a question somehow. Though I think it's a very interesting thing you talked about. I was telling you about me and a friend watching Champions League and seeing these big stop war commercials during the Champions League match. And I was arguing with him. I was saying this is worse than not saying anything because they continue playing as if everything's normal. And listening to your to your presentation, I was thinking maybe one of the things that this does is enables us as consumers to not look and keep looking at what we want to look at. Let's say if it's a football match or if it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. So in a way, it kind of keeps our eyes on what we were supposed to look at from these powerful corporations that want us to keep looking at their product. So in a way, it's a way to keep our eyes on that. And I was thinking why maybe one concept that could be useful in this conversation is responsibility. And what I was thinking maybe is when big corporations such as Facebook and such kind of demand their users to participate financially in the aid of Ukraine, that's where I felt like extraction might be relevant because we have some of the most wealthy people in the world who own these companies, and they could easily give a lot of money to help, and it would be much less difficult for them than their users to give even a lot less, of course, right? If we're talking about percentage. But what they do is they're kind of saying, no, the responsibility is on our users. And in that manner, I think they look at their users as a resource. And there, I think I felt like extraction is very useful because they I guess the most powerful players in the world feel like there's a responsibility. People are looking at us, and then they in a way channel that responsibility to their users. So it's another way to extract something from the users that's not usually, it's difficult to talk about it as a commodity, right? Because it's something else. But I guess what I wanted to ask is, where do you see like responsibility in this, if it's relevant to your, because I don't think you use that concept.
Yeah, like 4 or 5. It's like
otherwise we go to a pub. I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, thanks, Federico. Even my question is addressed to you. I think it takes on what Sandro was saying, but also what Alex was saying. To me, it feels like you have been using Move and Rancière, but you're taking Move more seriously than Rancière. And I think a lot of the questions that Alex is asking is actually coming as a result of that. Because I think if I understood Rancière correctly, I think he kind of solves the problem that Move is talking about, because there's no longer this sense of antagonism in his idea of the political. So you don't have depoliticization happening as easily as it would happen in the case of Move. So I feel like if you do take Rancière seriously, perhaps some of these questions might become a little more clearer. I'm not sympathetic to that view, but I think that it might become a little clearer. And the second thing is actually, I feel like the context you're talking about obviously is very central, and it's very sort of Eurocentric in that sense, because if I was to think back about what happens in India, for instance, Amazon would run campaigns like this for practically everything in the world, right? So it's not something that's unique to a war sentiment, but it's a sort of effect that is produced even if there's a famine or there's drought or even something much smaller, right? These things will come on the first page of Amazon for a lot of other reasons. So I was wondering if there's something about this extractive process that you're talking about that's very particular to Europe and Ukraine in this sense, or is it something that you could think about in the context of other places where this happens far more frequently and it's not something we're not used to, right? And they do raise the kind of money you need, and sometimes they run it through like UNICEF and stuff, but other times it's just Amazon itself doing the same thing. So I was just wondering if there's something you want to say about that as well.
Yeah, thank you for this remark. No, I mean, like, the reason why I used the war in Ukraine is that it was the first thing that, you know, made me think of the concept of moral extractivism, and I think it can be as well applied to the cases you mentioned. That this is interesting also for future research in general, because I mean, obviously, if we could only use moral extractivism for the specific case of the war in Ukraine, it would be pretty useless, I think. So yeah. And I'll take also the advice on Rancière. I think the reason why I maybe think MOVE is still in a way relevant is because she takes really the ethics as central to the idea of the political, and I'll come to the notion of I'll go directly now to the notion of depoliticization. And obviously, I mean, I think the notion of antagonism, yes, it can be in a way. I think that we should also take into consideration not only her stress. She really stressed it a lot, the importance of this aggressivity, this antagonism that you discharge onto the end. But I think we should also start to think about the eros, about the love. And I think in this sense, if you see in society practices that construct a we, and there is that they construct a we. I mean, my point is, I'm not really sure why it's a problem to consider the antagonism really a limit to the political, to be honest, in the sense that yeah, I don't understand why it's a problem. No. Ah, okay, of course. No, yeah. No.
And the institutional dimension is very important that it moves understanding of the political. And the institutional dimension is always the national.
But I think you can take the theoretical apparatus and then also apply it outside the institutional framework. I mean, I would need to see a concrete case to understand. I mean, I'm interested in seeing the limit of it, but I would need to see the concrete case where this wouldn't be helpful.
Read a book on Spain, for instance. The book she wrote with Emilio about Spain, of Podemos, it is entirely constructed around the idea that Podemos should become a national party, a party capable to promote the national identity of Spain. And modestly, I think that this is the reason why Podemos failed, because they listened to such advice.
But
so,
no, I understand.
No good relationship with
no, but I mean, like, okay, but
it's my problem. You know?
No, but I don't think that this necessarily, like, her. I don't think her advice necessarily follows from her theoretical apparatus. For instance, if you just follow her theory and you apply it by saying, okay, you should construct a transnational movement instead of a party, you can still follow the same, I think, theoretical apparatus without problems. I think she gave a specific, in that case, articulation of her theory, but I don't know. Yeah, I mean, why extraction and why not capture? If extraction is the operations of capital that draw on social cooperation in which capital is not directly implied, then war morals, they indeed fall in the definition of extraction. And in this sense, yeah, I mean, capturing, it would miss the sense also in which the capital needs to create the condition for the extraction. So like they actively operate in order to create the condition for war morals to proliferate. Gamma, that's what they do. And also extraction, I think it's useful because it can allow to see how the concept of moral waste is relevant, because that's the output of the operations, right? And yeah, it allows to capture like the many dimension of the phenomenon. That's why I find extraction much more useful than I mean, like when the war broke out, and I was reading your book, it really helped me to see it through the lenses of extraction. If I didn't have that concept, it would have been much harder for me to grasp the phenomenon. And done. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for your comments also. I think I missed maybe one or two parts, but especially the one on you were mentioning a concept or a scholar who is focusing on this notion that mining is also like it can be extended in time. It doesn't have to be done now. So I'll ask you later who that was. Thank you. And yeah, but I'm also not really focusing on this aspect so much, because it was really just yes, one of the many topics that were raised within my interviews and conversations, and it wasn't raised by many. It was raised by one important person. So I wanted to mention it, but yeah. And then you asked why I'm taking the notion of imaginaries instead of yeah, different concepts. I did this because there's in the Arctic in general, I wanted to give the article a bit of a large scope regionally as well, and I'm talking a bit about the Arctic as a larger region, and the notion of imaginary is coming up quite a lot in anthropological but social science literature on the Arctic when it comes to this generalized view. And first of all, I thought, oh, that's interesting. Like, what do they mean by imaginaries? Because a lot of time it's not really explained. And I was wondering, how do they differentiate? How is that differentiated from culture? And yeah, and then because I'm obviously colonization, decolonization, and indigenization are important concepts, and the notion of imaginary in relation to the Arctic is often used to talk about the fact that the Arctic is seen as a white space, as a frontier, as an uninhabited land, as wilderness, and so on. So it is really actively imagined by people who've some never set foot in the region. So I thought this was an interesting notion, and I thought in the sense of complicating this narrative also of people much further south who've never set foot or have only briefly visited the Arctic, as I have done myself, allowing themselves to have all these imaginings of the Arctic. How do people who actually live there and who've lived there for millennia imagine their lives and their lands? So I think that's what drew me to this notion of imaginaries. And the other reason is also because there's some scholars who are saying that it's crucial to direct our attention to imaginaries and to understand them, and to understand those regional imaginaries in the Arctic as well, in light of the climate crisis and global warming. which of course is very much exacerbated in the Arctic. I've just been to a General Assembly of the project on permafrost thaw that I'm working on as well a couple of weeks ago, and I learned that the Arctic is not warming 3 times as fast as we have thought so far, but it's warming 4 times as fast as the rest of the world. So it's always very bad news chasing the other. But I thought that is interesting that we need to, and as Alexandra mentioned, divert our attention not only to the materialities, but also to the symbolic and the symbolic interactions in relation to extractivism and mining, and that's I hope it answers a little bit your question. Okay, thank you very much. And I really liked your comment, by the way, on your talk. And I thought about this concept of self-responsibilization. Which And I, by the way, I appreciated your talk too, because I thought it was very original as well, and it very much reminded me of that moment where I clicked to send a donation, or I sent an SMS actually. And at that moment, I had these images of like, should I mobilize? I was in an alpine village in Austria, small village. I was thinking, should I mobilize? Should I just like stand on the street with something and talk to people? And then, poof! It just went away. That I was like, nobody will come, and people will think I'm weird, and I don't know. So yeah, I appreciated your talk.
I think there's a couple of people who really want to ask a question.
Sorry, but I didn't answer all the. So just because I didn't answer your question, I forgot. Sorry. Yeah, and just quickly, no, I actually didn't differentiate between the different emotions. So in that sense, they all have the same quality, from my perspective, and for what concerns here. Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's totally fine. No problem. Do we have a mic or just this one? Oh, you have. So Ruslan, go first, and then.
Okay. I want to thank both speakers for the presentation. And my question is to Federico. And the question is only based on the presentation, so maybe the answer is in the paper. So in your presentation, at some point you say that this kind of potential and energy to go to the streets get sometimes exhausted by the click and possible donation that people do. So, and this actually implies to me that those two things, being politically active and donate or click, are mutually exclusive. And I think it's problematic, or at least we need some evidence for that. But even if they are not mutually exclusive, I think still, in the presentation at least, I like some evidence that those two things are actually related. Because I don't see why people cannot do both, for example, and I don't see why can do neither of those things. And also, I think it's important because in a way, if there is no such evidence, it presents the current situation both worse than it is and better than it is, because it might be actually better than it is. I mean, some people might just click and donate and again go to the streets, but it can be actually worse than it is, because by saying that some kind of energy or potential was distracted by this kind of online activity means there was some potential. And from what I see in many cases, some kind of political action, like going once a week on the streets, asking your government to stop buying oil and gas, is not even on the table. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for your papers. So just a question or a comment for each of you. For Susanna, sort of building on Soumya's question of the stakes of thinking with imaginaries. And I wanted to push a little bit on the political stakes of thinking with imaginaries. And you've presented nicely the sort of question of imaginaries in terms of its discursive dimensions. But I think there's something important about the idea of imaginaries that speaks to its psychic dimensions. right? And the notion of imaginary is quite central, for instance, to Kaan. And so, so I'm wondering if I could push you to sort of think about the relationship of this notion of the imaginary to what Kelly Oliver calls the colonization of psychic life, and maybe to push you to think about the relationship between the material dispossessions of land and resources by extractive economies and the dimensions of psychic violence that it entails. And I think that thinking strongly with imaginaries would have really sort of push at that link. Federico, my question is going to be in some ways a reiteration of other questions, which is that on the one hand, your critique of humanitarian morality is very well taken. And I think it does link to a sort of longer duration critique of humanitarian reason that at least goes back to the 1990s. Importantly, OCS, right, who links humanitarian reason to logics of imperial war making. But what I wanted to push you on was, what is your implicit notion of politics here? Because your idea of politics seems to be connected to a politics of protest and the politics of the public square. But I wonder if this itself, at least in Chantal Mouffe's rendering and in its 21st century Western manifestation, is itself a depoliticized politics, right? And here again, going back to the connection to Rancière, right? For Rancière, protest was not enough. It's absolutely essential to connect that protest to what he calls dissensus. So that question of what would dissensus entail here is something that I would like to push. But even more, kind of going back a century or so, I'd like to think with someone like Rosa Luxemburg, again, for whom, protest is not an end in itself, it's connected to something like the general struggle. In other words, sort of a process of gathering becomes political when it serves as an interruption to the valorization process of capital, right? So I'm wondering how you might think politics more strongly than Mouffe's idea of an articulatory politics, to think about what forms of collective action might interrupt war logics, which, as Sandro argued this morning, are themselves extractive logics, right? So what's the extractive modality of Russia's invasion, and how might we imagine interruptions of it? You're seeing those interruptions attempted by the state and by financial capital through things like sanctions. But how might one think about a popular politics that actually interrupts these interruptions?
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. I have a question for each of you. Okay, there. So first for I'm blanking. Susanna. So it seems to me that the questions that the discussant asked came from this very traditional perspective on ethnographic work as the work of studying the native and uncovering the native, uncovering certain truths about certain power dimensions, and that your work came from a lot more of a reflexive ethnographic tradition of like community participation, respecting the secret, opacity, standing with and speaking as faith, to cite Kim Tolber, rather than exposing something. But you also encountered trouble, thinking in Donna Haraway's terms, like the troubles that are quite emotional, quite difficult. As someone, I'm very interested in how to do ethical research. As you being someone that faced the trouble and made decisions about those troubles, but they clearly stayed with you, even if in different forms in the outputs, etc. How do you think, as a researcher, with your specific positionality, what do you do if you encounter indigenous narratives that might be harmful or that you think are harmful? And if you do encounter them, what is the role of the researcher that wants to work with the community and not to uncover the community, not to render it visible to an audience of selves in that sense? And then for Federico, I'm sorry, I'm blanking so much. I'm so bad with names. Yeah, just kind of building on two participations, the thing of keeping our eyes fixed on something and allowing us to continue doing that thing. And then Viswesh idea that Amazon does this all the time for many other campaigns. It made me think of two questions, which is what is being extracted, and by the same token, what is being produced. And from those two interventions, it seems like effectively what is being produced is a form of biopolitical control rather than profit. Because as you were saying, sometimes the campaigns lead nowhere, you don't raise the funds, the companies are not actively making more money, but something is being produced. And I think that that's your idea of depolitization. So is what being extracted from us a certain ability to act in the world? And I'm thinking a bit with Marx, like, or innate ability to want to be creative, and that as a base for the political. Yeah, it's more of a comment question. What do you think? Kind of thing. Thank you.
Last one.
Okay. Thank you both for the presentations. They were really informative and inspiring. Just a short, not exactly question, but a provocation for the moral extractivism, building on the materialities, the discussion on the materialities. I was wondering if you can elaborate a bit more on the materialities of the medium. By medium, I mean the digital platform. How do they affect or they redirect the political praxis or the post-political, however you put it? Because you mentioned, for instance, that the political presence was reduced to this clique, and that the infrastructural platforms constitute the digital space. But okay, it's a very interesting case study, but it's the first war in the post-COVID era, and we've been through COVID, and we kind of seen many aspects of the digital realm. So I sense there's more to say there, like what sort of tools you use to analyze this digital realm, and how did you actually approach that? And maybe I'm suggesting that, reorientate a little bit, you know, the tools and the methodologies. What sort of lenses do you use to analyze this space? And yeah, maybe that can open the discussion of either the return of the political or the discussion again for the political in the digital realm. And this is to move very far away from Latour and not go towards Lenin about the the mediums and their role in the political praxis. But yeah, I sense that there is something there more in the way that you worked.
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it short. First of all, thank you very much for your comment. I can feel that it's sort of bringing a smile to my face because it's true that I think I'm coming from quite a different tradition here, and one that's actually being created at the same time that I'm doing research. That's something I'm trying to come to terms with too, is that, when I think about my research, I think it's clear to everybody that we should be working towards creating good relationships and working with First Nations and not about them, and that it's like all these like OCAP principles and consent and all these things that are like, that to me seem now very, very normal. And that's just how you do research. Are actually many parts of another disciplines are not normalized yet, but they hopefully will. And it also means that there's, some people would call it censorship. I would call it it's a more ethical, relational way of doing research. Is that when I write an article or write a text, it will be read by representatives of the First Nation, and it's the goal is, as you say, not to expose and not to point fingers, to point to things that are known anyways, but to help create these long-lasting, trustful relationships that are actually helpful for working towards a better future. What your question was, what do I do when I encounter narratives that are harmful? I would say, first of all, indigenous peoples and are just as any other peoples are. There's some people who I agree more with and others who I don't. There's opinions that I agree more with and others I don't. When I encountered narratives that I found to be, for example, racist or so towards, let's say, like Asian workers or so, like that, I feel, okay, there's, I don't know, a sense of hierarchy or so. What are they doing? They're here, they're taking our jobs. It was just like reminding me of discourses in Austria, for example, about the same things about migrants. And I thought, well, okay, yeah, that exists here just as much as there, but that's not a surprise, and that's not something I need to talk about necessarily. And then when I encountered oppositional views within the community, for example, when I was collaborating on the creation of a cultural center, I talked to different people, and these different people expressed different views on how they see this cultural center materialize. And but I was working closely with the person who was mainly in charge of the project, and of course, I respected that she had heard all those views as well, and that or he or she formed their opinions knowing all these things already. And again, that I'm the newcomer and I can provide a bit of an outside perspective, but that it's not my role to openly challenge everything, more to be part of a conversation and, like I say, like be a respectful partner in the process. So I guess, yeah, just trying to be respectful and take the time to listen and yeah, not come to quick conclusions or judgments.
Okay, many questions to answer, so I'll try to be as quick as possible.
You can also answer one to one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that charity or donations or digital donations are mutually exclusive with being politically active. But like what I'm referring to is to the if you take the span of time of when a person opens social media and sees images of the war and feels this effective charge, and then they click, that in that span of time, that energy is gone there. It come, you know, like if you're a typical person that both gives charity and then is politically active, it's because you had chances outside of that moment also to accumulate more effective energy to get interested than to be politically active. I don't know if that's clear, but maybe we can talk about it afterwards, because it's not easy to. But I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. So this is the short answer. And no, I think you're right. It's I mean, politics is not only being taken the streets, obviously, and the reason why probably I used that image, metonymically speaking, I think it was because at first people started to take the street, and then right afterwards they stopped doing it. So I think it was more a way of it was just a metonymical device, and I think it's more can be done, like reflecting on what is to be politically active in, especially also in this context. So yeah, I take it as a good comment, and I will work on that. Then I think your integration was good, really good. So yeah, your comment is, yeah, it's correct about the biopolitical dimension of it. Yeah, it nicely captures it. And I think you tried to ask me if digital space is a sort of dead space for politics, in my perspective, more or less. I don't know if I understood that, but like I think in the digital space and in the interaction with our smartphones and everything, we can be politically active. Obviously, you can use social media in a political way and not only in an individual or private way. But I mean, I think your question was much more wide, and we can talk about it afterwards, because I think we ran out of time. Yeah.
Sorry. I just wanted to say thank you for your comment, and I will definitely look more into the notion of imagination, also from the point of view of Lacan, and I think you mentioned Gary Oliver, so I will, yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
generosity, the intellectual involvement, the thoughts. Tomorrow we'll start there.